Hello, everyone. My name is Emily, and I'll be co-hosting this session with Giulia. And today's topic is multilingual LLM experiences. And I am so excited about this one because it's something I don't know too much about, but I feel like it's very important, especially for LLMs. Yeah, we have an amazing panel of experts, and let's, I guess, do a round of introductions, and then we'll get started. Michelle, do you want to go first?
Sure. My name is Michelle Littles. I've been working with conversation design for about 7 to 8 years. I'm currently a lead AI designer at Delta right now, and I'm really excited about this conversation as well. This is one of the reasons why I actually started in conversation design. So,
Ooh, it's amazing. Thanks for being here. Kiran,
um,
you want to go?
Hi, everyone. I'm Kiran Mascarenhas. I've been leading the content and AI design teams at T-Mobile, where I had the great pleasure of working with Collin here.
Awesome. Dmitry?
Hey everyone, my name is Dmitry Tereshenko. And based on the East Coast, I've been in the AI sphere, I would like to claim in the conversation design space, but it's kind of been weird. My hat's changed a lot in those 5 years being in the AI space. But I like to describe to people, I'm a linguist first, a technologist second, and a consultant third. So at the very core of all of my work, I love to honor the value and power driven behind what can happen when we look at language as a medium of constructing our worlds. In my academic tenure, I kind of explored that through medical linguistic analysis and conversational analytics in the cultural act of storytelling, as well as looking at the differences between when humans interact with each other and when digital technologies evolve, how it changes our communicative infrastructure, locally, regionally, nationally, globally. And so all of that kind of feeds into one reason why I'm also really excited to be on this call, because language is messy and it's diverse. And that's that.
Yes, definitely. Collin?
Hi, Collin Carnahan. I'm based out of the Seattle, Washington area. I've been in conversational AI for going on 9 years soon. Worked at companies like Rocket Mortgage, Walgreens, Workday, all leading conversational AI there. And now I find myself at T-Mobile as a principal conversational AI designer. And like Kiran mentioned, I worked with Kiran closely.
Awesome. Well, I guess let's dive right in. So this question is actually inspired by a post that Kiran made. So it's about gender. So I'm really curious, for multilingual experiences, how do you approach languages that use gender when referring to people, and especially when the gender is different between the languages? Or yeah, do you lean into neutral construction, or ask people to identify their gender? How does that work, or how do you approach that? Maybe Kiran, do you want to start, or Collin?
Well, Kiran was one that made the post. It came from some work that we were doing at T-Mobile. So, Kiran, you want to introduce where that even came from?
Well, I asked the question because I didn't have, it was a genuine question I was exploring. And I do think that that's important. I think one of the problems we have is a surfeit of confidence, where people are just kind of feeling like they know everything, and AI tends to exacerbate that illusion. So starting with humility and approaching the people who understand the language deeply. In this case, we have localization experts. We have a Spanish speaking localization experts. And when we approached them, they said, we don't know anything about AI. And I said, what does that mean? You know what you know, you're experts in what you do, which is localizing Spanish experiences, and that is what we need to make this good. So starting with asking questions and tapping into the hive mind is important. Humility is important. So that's one thing. And then when it comes to AI, we've learned not to overburden the system. So some lightweight rules or guardrails, like if-then rules that can flex. Examples. I don't recommend leaning into neutral construction, for example, all the time. When people onboard onto an experience, when you collect their names, also collect their pronouns. And I would recommend framing it that way rather than leaning into, the very heavy business of gender and, their bodies, anything approaching that for most companies. Like we work in telecom, so pronouns work. What else? And then here's something we did a lot at T-Mobile and which I love and always recommend. Always be testing. Test all the things. You don't know what your algorithm is going to do. It's complex. You may expect it to do something. You may design something. What it's actually going to do, we don't know.
Collin?
Yeah. Thanks, Kiran. A lot of, so like, with the advent of like generative AI and LLMs, like it has opened up the door for companies to just kind of hook up to like language models. So the translation language models, so that now, back in the day when we were writing like NLU style work where we were actually writing every single string that the bot was saying, like you would have to have a team of like translators and localization people that were kind of localizing and translating the content for you. But now we've kind of like given it over to the AI to let the AI kind of just like do its thing. And we put a lot of trust into it. And so at T-Mobile, we kind of opened up that Pandora's box of like, hey, let's let the AI kind of do this like translation work for us across 52 languages. And that comes with like a whole host of like kind of like unknowns. Like Kiran said, like we have a translation localization team at T-Mobile who, they're still getting familiar with like how generative AI works and how we tailor it and kind of like wrangle it in and control it. One like a weird instance is like when we're translating things from like Russian or like Ukrainian, like even the gender of the voice or the person that is speaking the language construct changes based on the identified gender of the person. And so like we would have our AI as a female presenting voice, but sometimes she will speak as if she is a Russian or Ukrainian male, and the voice and the verbiage kind of and the way that she's speaking like comes off as like strange and weird to some people. And so like these are like kind of things that like we're now just kind of just diving into and like finding out and discovering of like, oh, we need to actually like now have to have like rules and guidance around gender based on this like AI's presenting voice that we're using in our company. So it's just kind of this like weird Wild West where we are just figuring things out as they come up. Like Kiran said, like we identify a lot of this through our testing.
Collin, if I can pick that up, I find your example very apt to my, both personal and professional experiences because I'm Ukrainian American. So I was born into the Ukrainian diaspora. So I'm, from the United States. I have one, American parent, one, post-Soviet Ukrainian parent. And my first languages were English and Russian. And I'm actually just now in this stage of my life actively trying to reconstruct my confidence in Ukrainian and actually learning Ukrainian more proficiently for a whole host of reasons. But like I was noodling on this question a little bit while Kiran was opening the topic, and it's when I was first kind of like reading through it, I was kind of like thinking it's very interesting that the question that is posed towards handling gender with people, because with so many languages, gender is actually like is an inherently bound construct to human things as well. So like, if you speak any language, that genders, the nouns in the world ecosystem within which you exist, there are some things that you can kind of automatically kind of understand about the world that the user may be interacting with cognitively based off of kind of the gendered considerations of the language on non-human objects in their worlds, which kind of makes me like kind of think, Collin, to what you were just saying of like, oh, so sometimes your voice assistant might be, while the actual voice is meant to be more feminine, but may sometimes, or like, kind of bleed over to like a different gender's patterns in terms of like, because it is very different. Like, there are some things that I would say in Russian or Ukrainian, as, a male interlocutor that, let's say, my sister may not, because she's a female interlocutor. And so it's just like the actual construction of what you vocalize in, those types of languages are, bound to both your gender, but then also your perception of the genders of the non-human things around you. I don't know where that train of thought is going entirely, but I do really love what you brought in there. And it kind of connected to what I was kind of wanting to bring in on the subject of, I think it is very important and this might be more of like my recent professional brain has been more so in like data handling of ecosystems that feed into models rather than like the end user, like conversational interface. Of what can be learned when you look at gender of the humans in the loop and gender of the non-humans in the ecosystems of, whatever area of conversational interest that, you might have. I'll pause there.
Michelle, do you want to add anything?
Yes, I guess I'll be the oddball in the group, but when it comes to gender, I approach it very softly, right? So I'm asking, how would you like us to address you? Because gender is, like you were saying before, we're messy people, humans have emotions, it's a sensitive topic. I'm thinking about it culturally. So I don't jump out there and say, hey, what would you like to be? I identify as just, how would you like us to address you? That's how I deal with gender and then go from there. And to your point, in different languages, there is the masculine and the feminine, but I first start with, how would you like us to address you? So that's why I would adjust it.
Yeah, I guess like in the same spirit, there's also languages like I'm familiar with German, where I've seen a lot of chatbot actually asking about, do we want to interact with the formal or the informal approach? Would you say you do the same there, or do you assume one of the two postures based on the context of the conversation?
I actually let that conversation build, right? Because depending on, again, the language, there's certain nuances, right? So if you're speaking Spanish in one country and another country, these are all different. So it's a cultural thing. So I let that conversation more or so lead, right? So they can identify, okay, this is where we are. Okay, maybe they're being informal, because for some languages or some cultures, being informal to them is a big no-no. To us, it may be, hey, I'm presenting myself as someone who's everyday, someone who you can speak to, someone who's hip. But in another culture, that may be, no, you're too informal from banking. You're too much of this. So I definitely believe in that human leading. Like, I'm big AI, everything AI is using those tools again for that human. So I definitely design with that human first and that experience first. I let that guide everything that I do. For sure.
I think the formality versus informality is an interesting one. It's to do with languages as much an art as it is a science, right? And companies like to have rules. So it's that's what makes this hard and interesting. I spent a year in Germany, Giulia, and thinking back, I wasn't thinking a lot about branded content at the time, but I have this memory of going to McDonald's and drinking a cup of coffee and finding a joke at the bottom. I don't know if they still do this. That's a informal thing to do, but the way it was written was, Z's in this, right? Which is formal, you. So I think it's complex in Germany. Australia and the United States skew casual in that we certainly don't have a formal you, And we tend to use first names, except for the New York Times, which will still do like Mr. Carnahan if they have an article about Collin throughout the article, which feels a little archaic and definitely formal. So if you have a brand voice that is formal, it wants to communicate gravitas. So there's questions of voice. You can make rules around that, and that should be consistent across your brand. Whereas tone flexes to meet the customer where they are in the user journey. And there are also questions about culture. So thinking about culturally, who are your customers or users? Who are the people using your product? All go into language and localization questions. I don't have much more to say than that.
Yeah, no, Michelle, I really love, like, I also take a very similar philosophical approach whenever I, leverage any type of AI, workflow. I always design and develop for the human in the loop, full stop. Like, full stop. And so I really kind of love, this question that, Giulia brought up of like, how do you, posture, formality and register and like these more, nuance, because like ultimately to me, that question is about, a person's relationship with power. And because whenever an individual switches typically between a register in, either one language or, multiple languages, depending on the environment, it's almost always in consideration to some type of perceived power differential, whether it's, you as, a customer with, the, and then like with whatever, company that you work with. A lot of the spaces that I've worked in the past 3 years have mostly been in like government, private enterprises. And so trust is actually a huge dimension of the work, because if you're having any type of language model step in and handle public information and or governmentally supported infrastructure, the conversation that is inherently two-way. Like, it's no longer just you being a consumer of a product that you've purchased and then, opting into whatever guidelines, that you accept in that type of social consumerist contract. But in like governmental spaces, I've been finding that social contract between independent resident and governing structure is also very much elicited in the conversational process. But to the very beginning of what Michelle had said earlier, of always asking the end user, how would you like to be addressed? How should we address with you? Like, it actually, I think, shows kind of like a really beautiful intersection between the first question and this one of, again, gender is a very charged cultural topic in a lot of different environments. And it makes me think of how people introduce that kind of, that meta dialogue of, what can we actually negotiate about gender? Where is gender, aligned with naturalistic, things that we can negotiate or cannot negotiate. Kind of like what, Kiran said, so much of our work is like both an art and a science. Right. And often the arts and the sciences headbutt in moments when they should be, working together. But it kind of brings up the question of like, whenever, for example, a lot of gender sensitive dialogues that I hear, they always ask, well, what are your pronouns? Like, oh, well, that question in and of itself, instead of asking, how should we address you? I asking, what are your pronouns, actually shifts into that question of like what Giulia brought up too, of like, oh, well, am I being perceived in like a plural context? Am I being seen as more superior to the other interlocutor? Am I younger than them? Like all of these different things, because even with what Kiran was just saying of like how some news outlets will choose, some type of like Mr., Mrs., Doctor, some type of label plus last name. In a lot of Eastern European contexts, that's weird of in itself. Like, you never say, like, even in university, you don't go up and you're like, oh, Dr. So-and-so. You call them by their first name and then their patronymic, which is like, I guess it's more close to a second name, but you never use the Mr. or Mrs. So it's like that question that you brought up, Michelle, of like, well, how should we, it's like, first off, do you say, how should we talk about you? Like, are you honoring the voice of like the owner of the interface, or just the bot itself? Or like versus like, how should I interact with you? So I think what this question brings in really well philosophically is that difference between, there's a lot of messiness between even just pronouns, whether we're talking about gender or other kind of like power structures in the loop. I'll pause. I could talk about this forever.
No, but it's true, right? And then there's also it's a lot of testing behind this, because there's no way generative AI, is no way that we would know every single, nuance, every single localization, right? Even though we may have people there, but it's a game of putting it out there, reviewing, testing, and that's how I got to that, right? So it's tricky, it's messy, and you have to also have those guardrails in there of the brand, and this is how the brand will next like to be perceived, as well as how can we balance that with the perception for that person. But I think for me, the biggest thing is respect as much as possible, and starting off that experience, on a good foot. You're speaking to a computer, you're speaking to AI, right? But to have it as comfortable as possible. Now, I do believe that if we just translate and train our LLM, there's some things that are just lost in translation. It's just going to be, right? Unless we put those in there. For example, we can say, hey, we have this Apple computer, but the LLM may not, it may not know that Apple is a brand. And then it say, hey, an orange computer. And then that's when it throws everything off. And it's like, it jars the conversation, and no longer are you being helped. Now you're realizing I'm speaking to a computer, I'm speaking to, AI, and this is not the experience that I want. So it's such a tight rope, but a lot of it really is. And it really just goes back to a lot of guardrails, a lot of listening, and a lot of just trial and error. It's hard to say that we can't just put generative AI out there, because it's doing mathematics. It's guessing almost what the next thing is that it's going to say. So it may not know that nuance. So it's a heavy task, but we can do it. But yeah, it's a lot of trial and error for sure. It's a lot harder than what people think it is, for sure.
Sorry, one last little comment, and then we can move on.
Yeah, go for it.
These LLMs are mainly trained on English-based content, and we don't, in the English language, we don't use gender within our verb within a conjugation and how we like frame our language. And so there really is that need for the human in the loop, that is that expert that has a native tongue other than English, monitoring these things, that can catch these things. Because like I have the privilege of working with the quality assurance engineering team that covers 5 or 6 different languages, because just that is inherent with like the team that's like their native language. They have native languages outside of English, and so they can catch these things. And so kind of bringing it back to what Michelle was saying, like keeping that human loop, testing, and making sure that there's people that actually are like know what they're doing, rather than leaving it up to someone like me who is English is my main language, and I wouldn't know what is right or wrong without those experts there to help.
And there's no quicker way to burn that trust than, AI saying something that is just not culturally correct. We're trying to mimic what they're saying. It's no other way to break that trust quicker. And that's the whole point of trying to get them to trust, so that we can solve their problem quickly or take that away. So that's a big no-no. So it's very nuanced, for sure.
Yeah, we just going to that. We can't just hand it off to AI and like trust the AI is going to get it right from the start.
No. And I think it will be like that for a while, even with just English. So if I said, hey, I'm shopping, I'm using a shopping bot, and I say, hey, I want chips, and chips to me means a bag of Lay's or something. But chips in England, they thinking it's going to be fries or hot. So it's all of those little things that we have to account for as well.
And that actually goes to I want to dive into this a little bit more with testing. And how does that work, and how do you approach that? Do you have like specific teams? Do you focus on specific languages? Do you focus on specific locales? Or just curious to hear your approach.
It's dependent on the audience, right? So it depends on, what we've discovered from that audience. Are we getting more more population from this area. You know, the audience, the data, everything, that's what determines how I do everything. I'm curious to hear everyone else's approach to this.
We at T-Mobile earmarked hours in our week for the conversation design team to listen to actual, you know, when you call customer service and they say this call may be monitored for customer quality assurance, that actually happens. We actually do that. We listen because there, for example, if my grandmother were to hear, how would you like to be addressed? She actually wouldn't know what to do with that question, to be honest. You know, so that we have a certain way of thinking in the progressive culture that we're in that may not work for a new immigrant, new multilingual immigrant. So it's very important to listen to someone who is distressed, who is dealing with bill shock, and who just wants their problem solved in the minute, and may not speak English as a first language. You know, what are they going through in that? And, you know, to be trauma informed as well as dealing with the language barrier or whatever that person is going through. So listening is gold. And then also we've prompted a certain way, but the actual behavioral output in this generative model, like I said, it's going to do what it does. So that's one thing. But there are also other things. There's the human in the loop, as we talked about. There's data. There's the LLMJ, and I treat these all with various degrees of suspicion. The one I trust most is the actual voice of the customer.
Yeah, I can speak a little bit more to that process that Kiran was kind of talking about. We hold several listening sessions throughout the week to review chats and calls to, you know, determine whether or not, you know, these conversational AIs are like working for our customers. But now we're pulling in our translation and localization teams into these reviews to have them listen to calls and, you know, Spanish or, you know, French or whatever language we are wanting to like review that week, and then they'll provide feedback for us that we can then use to tailor better prompting and guidance around that. We do a lot of like automation in our testing too. So like we have several layers that the conversations go through to determine like whether or not this is like good or not. And I think this is an area where a lot of companies need to like improve a little bit on how we're reviewing doing auto reviews and evaluations on our content, because a lot of it is still focused very much on English test cases and things like that. And so we need to build out more automated test cases for non-English languages, which is something that I'm currently working on, and would love to see happen more across the industry. That's just the way that things are going. Sorry, it's all going towards everyone's pushing automation. So we need to like make sure that it's at least, you know, covering the basis for non-English languages.
Yeah, I keep hating to say that enter this concept is messy, but testing is messy because it always makes someone upset, and I kind of love that as like a business practice, because once you find discomfort in the system, that's when you can actually start making progress, once you can name the discomforts. So I think one of the things that I'm feeling drawn to share is how, like, at the very core of like all of my design philosophy is I design for cognitive equity, because where I was going in my professional, you know, track in grad school, because like I mentioned before I got into AI, I worked in medical linguistics, where like, you know, my graduate training set me on a path of both self-discovery, but also like just a new open area of research that I just could not disengage with. And that's just neurocognitive identity and how complex neurological experiences also come into play whenever we represent ourselves and have conversation. Because like I said before, one of my favorite areas to look at is storytelling, because when we create stories, whether it's I'm a sole narrator telling you this entire monologue, or, you know, we're telling it as, you know, a family, a group, a pair, you always learn so much about the cognitive world of the voices in the space. And like Kiran was saying, it's always important to also take into, like with the use case of like a dialogue around bill shock. Like often when people are interacting with, financial tools, they might be either very, very happy, or they might be beyond, it's beyond their capability of expressing the type of distress that they're in. And that makes me think of like one reason why I do really sit in that principle of designing for cognitive equity. And the easiest way to frame that to the largest number of audiences as possible, I see that as, how do I just reduce the cognitive fatigue of the other person on the end of this conversation? Because as someone, coming from an athletic background, one reason why I was drawn to medical linguistics is because I come from a very athletic family where I had a junior Olympic career where I was a gymnast for 17 years before I even went to college. And both my parents are gymnasts, and so I think about coaching as a framework for both training and developing language models, or training the humans in the loop who are adopting these tools that are built from these models. And coaching is a very emotional experience. It all kind of it ties back to what Michelle was saying earlier about trust. And once you burn that bridge of trust, it's really hard to recreate. And if you isolate yourself from a certain demographic of user, or any other human on the other end of that kind of conversational loop, from experience of having good coaches and bad coaches myself, both in my athletic career and in my corporate career, it's very messy. Again, tying it all back to that of I feel like I'm getting away from the very core question that that y'all brought up, but if we can just kind of get to that empathetic production point of, let's just actually make the life easier emotionally and cognitively of the end conversationalist, we can work through so many of these different variables that come up in testing and that's always, I guess, like if I ever get brought into a testing environment and I notice, oh, these stakeholders in testing are very upset, these ones are very satisfied, these ones are kind of upset, oh, these people don't feel like their voice are heard, as the subject matter experts on this. Because like, for example, with tying it back to our last questions on language localization, I've been a part of teams where we had a ton of really great talent, but maybe 50 of our quality analysts were working in English, and we only reserved resources to have 2 localized specialists of a particular language. And that disparity in resources in the testing environment would become very obvious. Like 2 individuals cannot produce the same amount of testing contribution to a larger workflow as 50 speakers of English. So I think testing can be done so many different ways, but that's my core philosophy. How do we make the life less stressful of the end conversationalist?
And so I just wanted to touch on testing. It seems like everyone on the call is aware of this, but just for, those who may be watching who are not aware of this, we may look at something and it looks like it was perfect, right? The data went out, the customer received their answer, everything looks perfect. But if we look at what I call the perceived respect, or how that person was treated, they could have gotten what they needed, but walked away and said, oh, I'll never use this again, or I can't believe the brand did this, or et cetera, et cetera. So that's also a huge part. Just because all of those, the back end and everything is working properly, what about the respect of that customer? How did they walk away feeling? Yes, we shot them over this link that they may have needed. Yes, we solved this build. And more to her point of how did they feel? And when I say, okay, how would you like to be addressed? That can be translated or changed over dependent on whatever that brand is, right? It may be a brand that's more formal. It may be a brand that's a little bit more casual. But the biggest thing is for us not to get caught up in just, hey, this fired correctly, this data parse, okay, they said the right thing here, but we're missing that actual, that human, the experience part of it. right? Because it wasn't a success. Even if everything went off properly on the back end, it still was not a success if that human left feeling other than how we planned them to feel.
Yeah, on the
I
flip side of
totally
that,
agree.
go ahead. Sorry.
I think that you do A/B tests. People love the A/B tests and the dashboards, but they tell us what happened. They don't tell us why. And you can get those metrics to move with really bad experiences. So it's very important to have qualitative customer satisfaction, research, those kinds of feedback mechanisms as well.
Yeah, just adding on to that, I've seen conversations too where it seems like everything's right and they finish the conversation, but if you look at it, they didn't get the right intent or they didn't get what they needed. So it's always so important to have humans in the loop. Okay, Giulia, do you want
to? I was just going to ask a question, but go ahead if you have something.
No, go ahead.
Just because we've been talking about testing and the process, and I was hearing at the beginning also Collin mention like, oh yeah, we're seeing so many of these things pop up in the conversations and we're having to adjust based on them and so on. And it made me think of like how old school conversation design, we're spending so much time in this beautiful tone of voice and the bot persona, and very intentional about how this should translate and localize into the different languages we had, because we had to, of course. And yeah, I'm wondering, how do you approach this today? Are you like very prescriptive with your tone of voice, or are you intentionally like then deliberate, like, or like a little bit vague maybe with the tone of voice so that it can go better, let's say? Yeah, I'm wondering, how do you
It's tricky because with generative, the less instruction you give it, sometimes the better it is. However, if you're working in a highly regulated industry, that could be a PR, lawyer, legal nightmare to give it that freedom. So, has to have some guardrails in there. So it's almost like we didn't really leave all of those, like lining everything up. We have a little bit more freedom with generative, but we can't trust a $1 billion brand to what this AI may say, right? So the guardrails are still a huge thing. It may not be as linear as it was before, but we definitely have to have those guidelines in there for sure still.
Yeah. Back in the NLU days, when we were had a lot more deterministic, we were writing every single bot response, we had a lot greater control over the voice and tone and style of all of that, because we were literally the ones writing the bot dialogue. And now we've kind of relinquished that control and put faith into this generative AI stuff. And like Michelle was saying, a lot of industries are heavily regulated and need to have a lot of control over even those generative AI experiences. And so it really comes down to creating strong prompting and using the tools that we have now available, like RAG, to have for instance, a glossary of localized terminology that the bot can pull from, or content for AI type of documentation that the bot is pulling from, so that it then has an idea of how it needs to shape its language and how it responds to customers when it's translating and when it's trying to localize content from usually an English source. Yeah.
At the end of the day, the bot is not going to be held accountable for customer experiences, right? That's us. But that's not the reason we do things. Also, we care no matter how much how good the bot gets at certain things. Care is still human territory, human to human care. And we are in this field because we are people who care about that, I think, a lot of us. We care about language, we care about people. That is sort of one of the traits of a UX designer, some of the traits, or a conversation designer. And so we are trying to now wrangle bots. That's one of our LinkedIn profile subheaders, bot wrangler. And now this is a really messy beast we have to wrangle. Yeah, so it used to be we could be control freaks about all the aspects of the voice and tone, and now it's shifted to light design. And I'm going to just harp on this so much, heavy on the monitoring end.
Yeah. This is making me, I'm seeing some of the, the comments coming in on like, people's appreciation of like either linguists being in the loop or like multilingual, agents, whether, from the training or monitoring or, whatever perspective, and like how that makes this a more digestible conversation for a global audience, because let's be real, LLMs are touching all points of the globe. And I don't know about if any of you knew this before, we don't speak the same language all over the entire globe. And so that I feel like that's something that a lot of owners of these tools go in with those assumptions, particularly with like the kind of hegemonic or power saturation of English on the global markets. And controversial, like counter to that, where English is not pragmatic to, market conditions. This all kind of makes me think of, I think this is one of the black boxes of language models and conversation design that I think we're not actually going to truly understand for probably another 30 to 50 years. And why I say that is because it makes me think of some of the very core philosophical bedrocks of like sociolinguistics and evolutionary linguistics, where it takes usually at least 3 generations of humans when 2 different language communities connect for the first time to actually develop a standardized socio-culturally established framework for communication where we could actually say, no, this is actually the standard. Mm-hmm. Well, once you start bringing in standard into any type of institutional context, now we're talking about, again, like what I was saying before, those power decisions from leaders who own and govern these tools of, because think about, one of my favorite things to kind of, to pull from my coaching days is I love coaching kids. Kids will tell you anything and everything, and they will use whatever linguistic repertoire they have access to. And so many times, like, think about, like, if you have kids or grandkids and they're saying something, you're like, I know what those words theoretically mean, but what in the world is my kid saying? Like, it's an example of just generational change that we can even see in the language environments of a single family. But when we're productionizing and sending out these language models, like, I remember one of my favorite things at, Unparsed, where I, got to know Emily and Giulia and other, conversation designers from the US, Europe, broader, like, this whole, my conversation design career kind of came in like as this transition from NLP development towards, oh, maybe let's actually use a generative assistant in the loop to kind of explore this. I would love just walking up to somebody brand new and be like, all right, so what are your thoughts on predictive guardrails and descriptive values? What do we want to describe of how like your tool is actually engaging? Which, again, like Kiran and Michelle and Collin have brought up, we can't do that until we actually sit down and we analyze and observe how the language is actually manifesting in real engagement. Like, we can test and we can, do all of these things in like the, the front end, building, and then something that I hear a lot working in the government private, intersection is what can we ethically build off of synthetic data, particularly in environments where we don't have access to the real data for one reason or another. What can we actually confidently build by theorizing and building our own language, like our prescribed linguistic guardrails for a communicative framework, versus like what can't happen until we actually deploy and we can start having that two-way dialogue of, no matter how much we do our A/B testing, or like, if let's say we check off 97% of like all of our check boxes and testing before deployment, and all of a sudden we're actually failing and only getting like a 20% success rate in real conversation, like it brings back that question of like, what as we of individuals of authority in this space, like what do we actually have authority over generationally? And like, no matter what we try, we're not actually going to learn until we deploy it. And whether it's, you know, future adoptees of a technology or future generations of human or whatever, like we're not going to know until our shared language, practices, and cultures evolve with this technology. And I think that's both scary and really exciting at the same time, because it gives us that ability to kind of, I feel it's similar to a printing press moment in like human evolution, where we now are getting to use this unique thing we call language and use it in such a new way. And when we see that happen in different historical cycles, like cultures change, institutions completely become something new. And again, that's terrifying, but really cool.
Just want to kind of go off of what Dmitry was saying. A lot of company, like back in when we were doing NLU, NLP, like we had a lot greater control of the models that we were using, so we can build out like language specific like chat models. But a lot of companies and large scale companies are just moving to off the shelf LLMs. They're pulling from OpenAI, they're pulling from Gemini, they're pulling from Meta, all these different models. And so like us as conversation designers and even like NLP and data scientists have kind of lost a little bit of that control that we had on the model, and we're kind of just a lot of companies are putting reliance onto these off-the-shelf models that they're pulling in and using. The problem is those update all the time, and every time we like build and design and prompt around, you know, translations and language for one model, and then the next model comes out a few months later and all of that just completely changes. And so like we're constantly now in this world of like having to adapt and change with these new models that are coming in. When we kind of lost control from it when we moved from NLP, NLU to LLM. So it's like there's still like a need for conversation design and people in the loop to like kind of adapt to it, because like I work really closely with a lot of like the OpenAI people, and like I will ask them questions about like, how does this model work for like translation services and things like that, and like they're like, I don't know. It's sometimes it's even like a black box to them. They're the ones that are like building it and now building these LLMs and controlling the data that goes into it. So it's like it makes me feel like there's still a need for us.
Yeah, well, that's why you need two things. One is building your company-specific knowledge graph on top of that, right? And conversation design and UI layer. So there's 3 layers you need to build on top of that. And say it with me, testing. Because every time the model changes, it's going to behave differently.
And I would go back to, like you were saying, building that other layer of the company's knowledge. I mean, that's vital. You can't just pull it off the shelf and use it. That's so vital. And making sure that you have like the company verified documents on how to handle this situation, how to handle, you know, XYZ situations as much as possible, as much as by the company standards as well, is very important, especially when dealing with generative.
So we've talked a lot about testing. I was wondering how you evaluate and like what kind of metrics you use to determine whether a conversation was successful.
I actually have, I think, Emily, a very quick answer. One of the most successful guardrails I've started to implement that I now adopt as like core to everything is if I'm ever iterating with a chatbot in any fashion, I tell it from the get-go, the only success parameter that can never be avoided is I have final say. Full stop. Like just as a human in the loop, if I do not agree with your outputs for one reason or another, that is what needs to be the end thing. And again, like when you open that up to like more of like a team perspective, like if our team, the humans in the loop, do not accept your rationale and or we can't see into your rationale or your traceability with a degree of confidence where we are ready as the humans to ratify and accept what you have shared to our joint venture of human interlocutor and non-human interlocutor. If I or we as the human in the loop do not trust it, then it inherently fails. Like, and having that meta dialogue to me has actually been very helpful in starting that kind of testing process. And I'll pause there. And I know that's kind of like a really hot conceptual kind of high level thing, and we don't always get that grace, particularly when in production with tools. But for my own personal use, like that has actually been something from more of like a development perspective that I found to be a really great guardrail as different models have evolved and changed the ways in which I myself choose to, you know, engineer prompts. And it's been very interesting, and I've been actually very happy with the overall outputs that starting any conversation off with an LLM kind of adds to the overall conversational journey.
Yeah. I kind of mentioned this earlier, but everything's going in the way of automation. Like that's what's being pushed on us. That's the direction that everything's going. And before we were doing a lot more like manual work to build out our evaluations, and we've moved towards building AI with AI. And so as we are prompting and making prompt updates and making changes to our style guides and our localization guides and things like that, we can then prompt in the things like Claude will build us evaluation sets based off of those prompts. And then we can go through and review those evaluation sets to make sure that they align with like our output. And at the end of the day, like what Dmitry was saying, is like it's kind of the human, the designer, the tech quality assurance engineer, the dev, whoever is kind of in there in the loop is the one that is kind of using their best judgment, saying like, this is like the good experience. This is like what customers need. And we need to have that historical knowledge from like our research teams. It's really a bunch of people all kind of shaping these bots and AIs, even though we're still doing a lot of it autonomously. Like it really is up to the subject matter expert, the conversation designer, to kind of sign off at the end of the day, saying, hey, this aligns with like what we need, and being that human in the loop.
Once you design the evals, the automated evals, do you then go back and review like what it? Okay.
We eval the evals. It's like you can't just like let it just go.
That. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's where having a very varied like workforce, where you have designers who have languages that have a native tongue other than like English in the loop, doing a lot of these evals, because like I can ask the chatbot to create an evaluation for me, but I don't speak French. I couldn't like go through and evaluate if this is actually a good conversation or not. So I need that expert to kind of come in and help out. And I think that's where we need to kind of like grow in this industry again. I keep saying like we need to grow because like there's still a lot of like need for people that have different skills and backgrounds to be in here providing their expertise.
The linguists in the chat will be happy to hear that. There's a lot of people commenting about the need for linguists, and I agree. It is important to talk about business metrics, the ones that the company, you got to keep the lights on. We want all of us to have jobs. The ones the company wants to track are growth, engagement, right, with the product. The thing that's hard is, are we growing at the expense of quality? We want to think about that. And the place where that dovetails with experience, which is what we care about, is retention. Are we retaining customers? Are we answering their question using an LLM experience only for them to call us back? And that's a metric we call recontact. NPS, a net promoter score. This is a vague number, very hard to parse, but it is something we track. Human in the loop is one we love. Of course, we've referred to that because our human in the loop testers think about things like tone, ease of experience, those more nebulous things. But again, listening to customer calls for the story behind the data is crucial. Our research teams are also so important because they have expertise for how to ask the right question in a way that's informed, and then listen in a way that's acceptable, and then parse through the data, qualitative data that they gather in a way to tell us the stories that are unbiased. They've got anti-bias training. Some people are just turning to LLMs for research, and like we just touched on, we should not be letting LLMs run amok without human touch in any aspect of our lives or work.
And I agree. And I just wanted to just circle back. And this is one of the reasons that I got into conversation design, because a lot of that, the training is so biased, and it's looking at one set, and it needs those voices. So I'm very happy to see this call and see the variety on this call and see that it's different perspectives and voices. And that's what we also have to interject when we're dealing with AI as well. So human in the loop is the biggest point that I'm looking at, because it's the human. We're helping the human. It's AI we're using to help the human. So if we remember that, I think we'll be in good shape.
So we're actually coming up on time here, but so maybe we could do one last question, and then we'll close out. Actually, let's just do it. Do you have any advice for people that are creating multilingual experiences?
Yeah, very. Oh, so sorry, Michelle.
No,
feel free to go for it.
Thank you.
Okay. I was gonna say, I think a really key thing here is, when you are at this tension of evolutionary change in language practices, something we've learned from analyzing multilingual classrooms is that if we overprescribe too much on how we are accepting and treating young humans who are growing in our society, we typically always end up promoting damage first to multilingual children before monolingual children in the classroom. So don't be afraid to use your entire linguistic repertoire to design how you're evaluating the linguistic repertoire of young language systems. Whether those young language systems are in the meatloaf of a little human or in the data center of a language model, like computationally. If we accept the fact that rules are flexible and we can play with them, there's so much more we can learn. So I always like to promote trans language over all.
And I just wanted to add in that we also need to remember that there are some people that are using more than one language in one conversation. So just making sure that you're getting all those intents and you're just prepared. So that would be the biggest thing I would say. Just make sure that, hey, it could be two languages, and we do that a lot, but the AI may not pick up on that. So just try to be as realistic and human as possible. I'm a big human in the loop person, so that would be my advice.
I recommend reading the last chapter of Empire of AI. I recommend reading the whole book, but especially the last chapter, which talks about minority language strategies. There's a couple of questions in the chat about that. Minorities do get overwhelmed and subordinated by this hegemonic structure, which Dmitry referred to, and connect with the community. Let's do this thing together and not compete with each other. Well, of course you may have to, but I think we can be a community. Let's be designers without borders.
My last little comment, I'm going to kind of take it in a little bit different direction. When you're working with a larger team, multi-cross-functional team, be that evangelist for having the subject matter experts in those languages there to help out. Don't let the product teams rely on Google Translate to help with the designs. Have someone that really knows what they're doing on the team help out.
Awesome. Well, I mean, there's so much more to cover with this, and this is definitely worth another part 2 potentially. But thank you so much for being here, and yeah, stay tuned for more panels. We'll keep you updated. And
Thanks for
Thank
doing
you
this,
everyone for
Emily and
joining.
Julia.
Yes, thank you, Emily.
Yeah.
Thank you, Julia, for hosting
Thank
us.
you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.